This project was supported by Award 15PJDP 22GK00946MUMU, awarded by the Office of Juvenile Justice and the Office of Justice Programs. The opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this videocast are those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect those of the Department of Justice. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Reflections on Research. I'm your host, Mike Geringer, Senior Director of Research and Quality at Mentor at our national office, and one of the leaders of the research board work on the National Mentoring Resource Center project. Thank you for joining us today for another conversation about mentoring research with a leading scholar in our field. And I'm really happy to be joined today by one of my very favorite people in the youth mentoring space, Dr. Tim Cavell. As a professor at the University of Arkansas, the Fighting Razorbacks, although sometimes in recent years they haven't been fighting too much. But I know at heart, deep down inside, you're an LSU Tiger through and through. So, but it's great to have you here, Tim. Welcome, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Mike. It's always good to see you and to talk about mentoring with you.
Sure. I want to start by asking you kind of a similar question to what I've asked all my guests this year on the podcast here, which is really how you got into the world of mentoring research. I think like many of your peers here on the research board, you really didn't start out, I don't think, as a mentoring researcher. I know a lot of your work deals with bullied children, aggressive children. So how did you find yourself doing work in mentoring? What was your journey to this field?
Right. A fair question. So my initial entree involved a student. I took a job at Texas A&M University, those many years ago. And as so often happens when a new faculty member shows up, sometimes there are orphan graduate students who are sort of looking for a place to land, a researcher, mentor. And there was a developmental psychology graduate student looking for a mentor. And so I agreed to mentor her thesis project, to advise her thesis project. And she said that she was interested in, and this was her language, adults who have children as friends. Okay, and I was like, I have to confess, at first, it was a little cringy to hear this at first. Like, what are you talking about? And so we had further discussion, and it became a project that we actually published on, having to do with important non-parental adults, informal, aka informal mentors in the lives of children. And we did it with a sample of college students who had identified themselves as having a father who was a problem drinker. So children of alcoholics who were college age. So that was my first mentor study. But then, but you're right. My focus was more as a clinical child family psychologist interested in prevention work, especially with kids who are aggressive. And I had a small grant, foundational grant, where I was doing some clinic-based work with parents of aggressive children. And I was finding that somewhat dissatisfying because there were a lot of families, kids that needed some help that were not being reached by that. And I had a colleague, her name was Jan Hughes, in the school psych program at Texas A&M, and she was doing similar work. And she was also somewhat frustrated by the fact that we weren't reaching enough families and kids in need. And so we combined forces. She said, let's do a project together. And we submitted a proposal to the National Institute on Drug Abuse to do a school-based prevention trial where we incorporated mentoring, community-based mentoring, as one component of a multi-component intervention. And our reasoning was that, yes, we can be supportive of parents and guide parents, but we also need to do something to increase the likelihood that these children have a supportive adult in their life. Because sometimes parents are not able to do it, they're not available enough to do it. And so we provided consultation with teachers and parents, but also paired them with a mentor. And this is a mentor that had been trained for an entire semester. I did the training as part of a three credit course. And then they mentored this child for 3 successive semesters, spring, fall, spring again. So it was high-end community-based mentoring, but we needed a control condition, and we weren't sure what to do there. We weren't allowed to do no treatment, so we created a no kind of a faux mentoring condition. Okay, and I know you've heard this story before, but the prevailing theory was that mentoring is only so good as the strength of the relationship. And so if we wanted a control condition that was inert, our reasoning was, let's water down the relationship. Let's weaken it so that it doesn't produce anything, which will be a good comparison for our experimental condition. To weaken mentoring, weaken the relationship, we insisted that the mentors meet with their mentees in school, at lunch, at the lunch table. So just imagine you joining your mentee with 10 other kids at the table.
Yeah.
So the notion of a close bond sort of goes right out the window, right?
Yeah.
Well, at least not entirely, but it's not an intimate conversation, that's for sure. And then the other thing we did was each semester across those 3 semesters, we pulled the mentor out and put a new mentor in. So even if it had been going well, we replaced the mentor with a new mentor. So we deliberately weakened the relationship. Okay. Well, lo and behold, when we looked at the outcome data at post-treatment, immediately after mentoring, there was no differences in the 2 conditions. But at 1-year follow-up, all the differences favored lunch buddy mentoring, this standalone faux mentoring condition. And so we were just puzzled by that. And so I've continued to do research on what's happening with lunch buddy mentoring. How is it operating? And have since pivoted to try to use that with kids who are chronically bullied, because these are kids who are often the victim, not only of just, being harassed by their classmates, but they're a victim of a story, a social narrative being told about them that is damaging. It's hard to fight. And so a mentor showing up twice a week at a lunch table is one way to counter that narrative about them. And so that's been the fun of pivoting from the fact that most of my research is based on a mistake.
Yes. Well, and I'm glad you stuck with it. I think many researchers would have run screaming from this field when they found out that their fake watered down program outperformed the really intentional, well thought out one. But I feel like that study highlights a number of things that are challenges in our field. One is, I think sometimes we overstuff mentoring with too many things. We ask this mentor, like, cover this curriculum or deploy this, evidence-based, strategy, or, we just give them a lot to do and a lot to think about when maybe that misses the point. I guess a follow-up question for you is, given that your watered down program outperformed the more intentional one, what's a lesson you think our field can learn from that? Is it to really, think deeply about what are the mechanisms of change that are happening through your program? Or I'd just be curious to know what you think folks could learn from your funny mistake.
Well, 100% that one. What are the mechanisms? I'm thinking back to when I came to the University of Arkansas, where I am now. I submitted a grant proposal to see if we can get some funding. We didn't get the funding, but it was looking at lunch buddy mentoring to help kids who were being bullied at school. And one of the critiques we got from the reviewers was, well, what are you going to train these mentors to do? Fair question, right? But I have to say, my first response, at least in my head, was, well, heck, we didn't train them the first time. Why would we train them? And so it speaks to the possibility that showing up consistently and showing up in that specific context was important. Now, you could point to maybe these college student mentors arrived with a certain interpersonal skill set that was useful with that age group, or the mere fact that they were cool college students brought with them a certain cachet. Yeah. And that if you're hanging out with a kid, that some of that cachet rubs off on you. And so you're no longer persona non grata. Maybe people start to gravitate toward you simply because you have someone of value with you. Yep. Well, none of those involve the strength of the relationship. Yep. Okay. So, which is why back at one of the first summer institutes that I was fortunate enough to attend, and I was presenting some of this research, and I naively posed this question And this is a room full of mentoring program operators, right? People that are just eat and sleep mentoring, youth mentoring. And I asked this question: is it possible that youth mentoring can benefit youth by means other than the relationship? Because I was thinking of these other mechanisms, right? Well, that question met with intense silence and confused looks on people's faces, because it made no sense to them. Because at that point in time, and to some degree still, the answer was mentoring, the outcome is the relationship. There's nothing beyond that that matters. Okay. So, which, links forward to an article that Sam McQuillan and Renee Spencer and I wrote called Back to the Future, where I revisit that scene in that paper. And we try to unpack what it means for our field, that mentoring can be about promoting a relationship, and mentoring can also be about promoting certain outcomes.
Yes, and I think it's very hard for mentoring folks to wrap their head around that. There obviously needs to be some relationship there. You're not just cozying up to a stranger on the bus and like having it change your life, right? Even in your watered down version of Lunch Buddies, like there was still some relationship that was being formed. But I think we often confuse like relationship strength with like the complexity and skillfulness of the mentor, like saying things or having the right discussion, or we talk a lot now about bridging social capital, and I'm introducing you to the right people that are going to open doors. But I think so much of being a mentor, particularly for younger kids that you were working with, is like, do I have someone who's expressing care for me? I might not be getting that at home, right? At all. Is that narrative that's being told about me in the school changing? And I always think of the fact that the term role model itself implies that that's kind of done silently, and that the child learns by watching you and just observing how you are. You're modeling being a certain way in this world. And all of that is not dependent on a strong relationship either. There's got to be some relationship, but
right.
So I
Well,
think
yeah,
it's interesting to think about mentoring having these different ways that the relationship can be helpful. It doesn't just have to be this dispensing of wisdom, right?
yeah. No, that's a really insightful point, Mike. We in the research side of mentoring have been woefully negligent at trying to understand and examine the role of modeling in mentoring.
Yeah.
It's in every description or definition of mentoring makes reference to a role model, right? But if we ever studied modeling specifically, I don't think we do. Have we ever brought to bear the research, the science on what kind of adults do children imitate, right? Well, there's some research on that.
Yeah.
They tend to imitate adults that are seen as powerful and competent, and that treat them with a certain amount of kindness. But we've not really applied that. How much time do we spend talking with mentors about how do you carry yourself? In what way do you carry yourself, and what is the lesson your lived life is for your mentee?
Yeah.
And so if you're showing up consistently and you happen to be a pretty good example of how to live a life, then that's a pretty good combination right there before you even open your mouth.
Yep.
Exactly. Now, the thing about it is you don't want to open your mouth in ways that are aversive, then you spoil it.
Yeah.
Right. So if you can just hang out and not be aversive and be a pretty good example, that's not a bad recipe for mentoring.
Yeah. And I feel like that's how a lot of natural mentoring relationships wind up forming. Student observes a teacher or a coach or a faith leader or something in their community,
right,
and sees who they are and sees how they treat people, and is eventually like, that's a person I might turn to for more help and perhaps a deeper relationship. But I think the first step towards those natural connections is observing, right? I'm watching you.
Yeah.
It's
Right.
A mentoring program kind of subverts that by just, hey, two strangers, bam, here you go, get to know each other. So it's a bit.
And I think that's particularly important when you talk about mentoring youth of color, because they're, the majority of mentors are not people of color, if I'm correct in my rendering of that research. And having been a mentor through Big Brothers Big Sisters and having mentored a boy of color, I can tell you that it was the fact that I was not Black, which he identifies as Black, I think mattered a great deal, because he was looking for examples to follow from men who were Black. Every time we'd enter a place where there would be a young Black man, he would really focus on that person, because I think he was hungry for examples. Unfortunately, his father was in and out of his life, so he lacked a consistent example. And I could be an example, but not a person of color.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that diminished my role.
Yeah, but that's okay, right? I mean, you were one form of mentor. There are hopefully other mentors that young man can get other things from, right? I think we make a mistake sometimes by asking our mentors to be everything to everybody at all moments, right? It's okay to have a bit of a lane to it.
I love that. I love that point. And I don't think we've generated sufficiently in the research side of things all the possible lanes there are.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned about social capital. There could be in the paper that Sam and Renee and I wrote, we talked about we imagine a form of mentoring that we call transitional mentoring. Okay. And this is a form of mentoring that's time limited and that's developmentally yoked to a particular point in the child or the youth's life where there's a need for a specific thing. Yeah. Right. And then the mentor comes in and does that thing. Well, we almost never talk about mentoring that way. Instead, we write and tell stories of long-term matches that are somewhat, miracle-like, right? But what if the focus was simply on coping with your parents' divorce, or coming to grips with the fact that you now have a chronic disease like diabetes, or you're coming out as gay or lesbian, or you've just been released from a hospital after a suicide attempt. There are some important moments in the lives of kids, particularly now with what's going on, where the support of a mentor through a passage in their life might be especially important. Yeah. But our organization writ large in terms of mentoring is not designed to do that. We're designed to sell the story of a long-term match. Yeah. And so part of the purpose in writing that paper was to see if we can have some paradigmatic change in how we think about what mentoring can do, as opposed to doubling down on what we've traditionally thought it does.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that paper. I really do want to unpack that a little bit for our audience here, because I think it's an important piece of conceptual work about the mentoring field. So you mentioned the title, Back to the Future. We can send out a link when we share this podcast recording. But what I loved about that paper was I felt like it was a little bit of a rebuttal to some criticism that the field has gotten recently, where because you have these focused programs that tend to produce some stronger results than some of these long-term kinship-like relationship programs, I think people are reaching this conclusion that we should stop doing that long-term type experience and quit focusing so much on relationship length and strength. And maybe it's better if mentors just do these shorter, more punctuated, tightly focused things. But I think the three of you argue in that paper that there's really two paths there. And what our field has been doing is doing one type of work, but expecting the results of the other. But you argue that both of those paths are perfectly valid and good. We just need to be more intentional about who are we giving which type of mentoring to? Because some children will benefit tremendously from just having a long-term person who cares about them and hangs out with them and they have some fun together. That might be the most meaningful thing ever. So I'm hoping you could maybe just unpack a few of the ideas in that paper a little bit more for our audience.
Sure, you bet. And I will say that that having Renee Spencer and Sam McQuillan as co-authors and having the opportunity to visit with them, we probably had 20 phone calls in the process of working on that paper. And that was one of the most enriching professional experiences I had, was writing that paper with them, because they are just lovely, incredibly smart colleagues. And as folks know, Renee is going to not drop the ball on the value of relationships and reminding us about relationships in and of themselves are important. And Sam and I have been probably on the side of saying, well, let's think about how you can use the mentoring context to introduce some preventative or educational experience. So it was a nice dialectic that was going on in the writing of that paper. And I'm reminded when I talk about this of our colleague David Dubois. David would do this thing when mentoring folks would get together where he would point to public health estimates of the number of youth who said they had an adult in their life that mattered to them, to whom they mattered. And I don't know if that's exactly the wording, but basically, the percentage of kids that had an informal mentor, some sort of mentor in their life. And he would talk about whether that estimate had changed over time. Now, David's in a public health, public policy department. So I always thought, well, he's one of those, that's what he does, but I didn't really understand it. But I think it speaks to exactly your point that one way to help and think about mentoring, helping kids is to grow the number of kids who actually have a mentor in their life. Okay. Regardless of what specific outcome it may be creating. And that's particularly important in a culture like ours because we are a fiercely independent people. Okay. We don't typically lean in the direction of interdependency. We like to be fiercely independent. And so sometimes we have difficulty with building a sense of community and everyone pitching in. I don't think we do a great job of thinking about collectively owning the responsibility of children's development. That's each family's individual responsibility, right? But if we're going to think about providing each child with an adult in their lives, then that is more of a collective responsibility. Okay. And that's the kind of relationship-based mentoring I think we should think about. Broad, not so much deep, but broad. On the other side, there's this focused way to think about mentoring. And I like the idea of this transitional mentoring because think about what we can do. Imagine, Mike, if you were trained up to work specifically with young teenagers identifying as gay and coming out, okay? And you had a special skill set to support those youth during that transition. Well, guess what? That transition is going to be time limited, and you could do it again. We could redeploy you multiple times, and then probably your skill set just improves over time. But that's not necessarily what happens typically in mentoring. Instead, you've got one match. The kid gets one match, you get one match, and sure, there's often some rematches, but typically it's the romantic notion about a match being long and lasting as opposed to being short-term and functional. So that's, to me, the takeaways from that paper, the main takeaways.
And I think the other thing that I loved about that paper was you gave programs permission to really think about the outcomes they're promising a little bit more holistically, right? I think we often see programs that make a promise to a funder like, oh, we're going to help them, stay in school. We're going to help them avoid juvenile justice involvement. And those are all perfectly fine and good goals. But I think one of the points you make in that paper is that you often have programs, as I said before, like that are providing more of this kind of long-term generalized help thing, but they are promising goals that would probably be better served by something punctuated and tightly focused and time limited. And I like that. Oh, go ahead.
Let's pull back from writing checks we can't cash, right? I keep thinking about my colleague Renee. Renee talks about the risk that parents take when they turn their young person over to a volunteer mentor. Yeah. And the dreams and hopes they have of what's going to follow from that. So it's a big risk. And if we can just focus on the consistency of their showing up and investing in that child, I don't know if parents need a whole lot more than that. Just don't quit coming. Yeah. Don't hurt my child and don't be inconsistent.
Yeah.
Those are two of the more, obviously damaging things. And if we just achieve that, that would be huge.
Yeah. Well, I also think this speaks to kind of the volume of mentors that kids need, right? And so I feel like if we give through certain types of programs a more limited experience, I loved your idea of redeploying this mentor who's really only good at one thing, right? Like if it's, helping kids apply to college, or in your example, helping adolescents with the coming out process or something like that, we might look at that person and say, well, you don't have all the skills to be this amazing long-term mentor, but they don't have to be if they're just kind of redoing the one thing they are good at. And so I feel like that's a way that we could maximize America's talent pool of adults, right, that are
Right.
available to
Right.
do this. Because not everyone's
Yeah.
going to want to do the 10-year match, right? Maybe they
Yeah.
don't. So I have one last question for you, Tim, and that is the bonus question. I have asked it of all of my podcast guests this year, and it's a twist on the classic, if you can invite 4 famous people from history to your house for dinner. But my twist is I don't really care who the 4 people are. I mean, you can tell me if you want, but I want to know what meal you are cooking for them and what music you have playing in the background.
Oh, well, that's kind of easy because I grew up in South Louisiana. And on the menu at that meal, without a doubt, would be seafood gumbo. And playing on the stereo would be a combination of Solomon Burke and Irma Thomas.
All
And if you
right.
don't know those two artists, I would encourage you to look them up.
I love the recommendation. I don't know those artists. I listen to techno, man. I barely listen to music at all. So I'm guessing Cajun bluegrass, something like
More
that.
New Orleans based soul and blues.
All
Yeah.
right. There you
Irma
go.
Thomas and Solomon Burke.
Okay.
When my brother, younger brother, unfortunately died a year and a half ago, and he requested that his ashes be spread on the ocean. So my other brother and I, we did that. We went out, we rented a boat, and we were sailing out into the Gulf of Mexico. And the captain of the boat, her name was Pam, Captain Pam. She said, "What kind of music do you want?" And I said, "Solomon Burke." She says, "I got it." She knew exactly who I was talking about. So that can make for a perfect day if you have Solomon Burke and seafood gumbo.
There you go. I was going to be disappointed if gumbo was not on your menu. I figured it would be. Unfortunately, as a vegetarian, I'd be eating some cold Campbell's soup while the rest of you chowed down on prawns. But it sounds delicious. That's the best answer to that question so far. One of my guests said they'd have it catered because they don't like to cook, and I'm like, oh. You have
Oh,
Beethoven coming to your house. You have to cook something. So, anyways, well,
yeah.
Tim, thank you so much for a great conversation today. I encourage folks to look up Tim's work. We'll provide a link to that bilateral framework, the Back to the Future paper that we talked about a little bit here. Thank you, Tim, as always, for your time and for all your contributions to the research board. And we hope we'll have a couple more episodes of this podcast throughout 2023 here. So look for a few more episodes before the year ends. But thank you for joining us on Reflections on Research. We'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Mike. Always fun.
Always.
Bye bye.
Take care.